How do you define a sprint cycle for a new project? Now, if I'm a Scrum Master or a project manager, I probably look at my organization processes and guidance. That's a one way of starting and identifying the sprint cycle. For example, if I am expected to work in a group of agile teams, other agile teams are also interdependent on me. My selection of a sprint cycle will be driven by what others are doing. Say, for example, if I'm a part of scaled agile team, then I need to ensure that my team is also following the similar sprint cycles with others. Similarly, I may have some organization level guidelines where the organization is doing a periodic reviews at a particular frequency, and they want to ensure that during that review time, my sprint should also be over. So that's also a possibility. Based on that, I may define my sprint cycle. Now, so that's an environment and organization process influence. What could be the other influence? Now, if we see a clean slate or a green field where I have to decide, or we have to decide as a team that, okay, guys, how should we define our sprint duration to start with? So what is sprint duration? It's a cadence, it's a pattern. This pattern helps us in completing the feedback cycle. We do planning, doing, reviewing, reflect on our performance. We take a feedback on our product. We do a feedback on our process, and we move forward. So a given time box is a rhythm which helps us in completing the whole learning loop, prioritizing work, doing the work, taking the feedback, and improving it. Now, this learning feedback cycle, I need to identify how long this learning feedback cycle could be. Now, Scrum guides you that not to have a more than 30 days, but should I have a 1 week? Should I have a 2 weeks? Should I have a 3 weeks? Or should I have a 4 weeks? So by default, people go for 2 weeks because 2 weeks learning loop is good, but I might have a special consideration on which I decide my learning loop. What could be those considerations? How long I or my team can go without taking feedback? If you are working on stable requirement, the stable technology, we probably can go long before we take a feedback because our planning, our prioritization, our understandings are pretty stable. So that may influence you to go towards a longer duration sprint cycle, maybe a 3 week or 4 week. If my feedback cycle is expected to be early because I am working in the very uncertain environment, and it might be too late if I do a 3 weeks feedback cycle, then I might be taking a 1 week or 2 week feedback cycle because our technology understanding, our requirement priorities or understandings are expected to evolve. So the more uncertainty, the shorter the sprint, the less uncertainty, the longer the sprint cycle might work. So that's a one parameter which can help us in identifying our sprint cycle. What could be other? What are the overheads associated with sprinting? And what are the benefits associated with sprinting? More or less connected with the first topic only, but in a little different and more specific words. So as you start a sprint, you may have an overhead of doing planning, reviews, and retrospective. If you do it every week, these overheads may be too much for you. But if you do it, say, after 3 weeks, these overheads are relatively less for you. But at the same time, there are also risks associated with delaying the feedback, delaying the replanning, delaying the retrospective. So we need to balance the risk and the overhead we are going through in order to identify the right sprint cycle for us. So that's another consideration. The third consideration you can focus on, how much duration is good enough to give a sense of urgency, at the same time also helping producing something meaningful which can be reviewed by the stakeholders. Because at the end of a sprint, you want to produce something which can be reflected on, which can be demonstrated. At the same time, you want to also not to delay this for very long. As you know, many times student syndrome and other terms are used because if you have a long duration, people may feel relaxed and they think that they will complete it after some time. So we need to identify something which creates sufficient amount of sense of urgency, at the same time produces something meaningful, which can be reviewed and we can take a feedback on that. So that could be your third consideration. You may have more considerations depending upon your environment and your experience, but in general, it's all about feedback cycle. In general, it is recommended. The shorter the feedback cycle, the better it is, especially when you have the uncertain or a new environment, because it helps us in doing reviews and other things. Maybe the other factor you may also want to consider is the engagement of the stakeholders. So the fourth thing which you may want to add here is how frequently your stakeholders are available to collaborate. Now, you may want to do a 2 weeks sprint cycle, but your stakeholders are not available every 2 weeks to give you a feedback. They're only available after 4 weeks. Then you may want to match their feedback, their engagement level, and your sprint feedback cycles as well. So how easily accessible your stakeholders are also may influence your sprint cycles. But usually organization has recommendations. You may not get an opportunity to this all analysis from the zero. You need to look how others are doing in the given environment and you move forward from there. In general, 2 weeks are majorly used if you talk in the community, because it's a balance, it's a midpoint between four weeks is like a 2 weeks, the midpoint. The second popular frequency I see is a 3 weeks. 1 week I rarely see, 4 weeks also I rarely see. So in general, 2 or 3 weeks, that's the only decision you need to make when you are working in the Scrum world. But these are the other parameters probably you need to consider in order to define your project sprint cycle or a feedback loop duration.